So today we'll be joined by Professor Mike Burrows from the Scottish Association for Marine Science. Mike will be talking about the process and findings of a recent review of blue carbon stocks and sequestration capacity in UK seabed habitats. So without further delay, I'll hand over to Mike.
Thanks very much, Sophie. I'll just share my screen with you right now so you can see my slides, hopefully. Okay, so the next half an hour or so, I'll be talking about the process and the findings of our study on the United Kingdom's blue carbon inventory to assess marine carbon storage and sequestration potential in UK seas, with particular emphasis on what part of that storage and sequestration capacity lies within marine protected areas. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the people who funded this work. It was the wildlife trusts, the WWF and the RSPB. And in the initial stages, the Blue Marine Foundation contributed to a North Sea review. So the work was done by ourselves here at SAMS, on the west coast of Scotland in Oban, by myself and my colleague Alistair O'Dell. We were joined by Heidi Tillin and Summer Grundy at the Marine Biological Association in Plymouth, who helped with some of the review work on, particularly on blue carbon in the southwest of England. And finally, we had a team of geologists, sediment geochemists from the University of St Andrews, who were Craig Smeaton and Bill Austin. And Bill is very widely known amongst the international blue carbon community. So all the stuff I'm going to be talking about now is there online for everybody to read and disagree with, hopefully. So the Wildlife Trust hosts the report. There are actually 4 regional reports and 1 summary report. So I would, if you were to start somewhere, start with the UK summary, and then if you've got particular interests in the 4 regions we covered, each one of those regions has a particular report separate to it. So standalone documents, all of them. About 10 years ago, actually more than 10 years ago now, obviously, John Baxter, what was then Scottish Natural Heritage, had been talking with Dan Foley, who was one of the authors of the IUCN original Blue Carbon report that came out in 2008. And Dan and John wanted to see what a blue carbon assessment would look like at a national scale. So in discussion with me and as a group of other people from SAMS, we wrote the first blue carbon review at a national scale for Scotland's coastal and marine environment. So that report formed the sort of template, if you like, for the work you're going to see. And it was followed on by a kind of a follow-up report with a little bit more review of the sedimentation effects in these sorts of habitats and how that mapped onto the Marine Protected Area Network in Scotland in 2017. So that was the work that went before this activity. A huge amount of interest, obviously, in the last 10 years or so in the role of blue carbon in the carbon cycle in coastal environments, how much carbon habitats like salt marshes, seagrass beds, kelp forests, and in tropical places, mangroves, can store and effectively remove from the ecosystem, and thereby, with luck, have some impact on the anthropogenic carbon dioxide problem. Here's some of those habitats reviewed in a 5-year-old paper now by Ollie Legg, looking at kind of trying to assess the area and rates of accumulation of carbon in habitats like salt marshes, seagrass beds, kelp forests, and the surrounding sediment habitats, mud flats, sand flats, which might not have any vegetation, but they're really important stores nonetheless. And the emphasis in this review and in our review is that these things shouldn't be seen in isolation. These habitats are connected to each other. They exchange carbon with each other, and they accumulate carbon from other sources as well as their own. So riverine inputs, for example, might be really important. And I guess the ultimate idea of reviewing carbon accumulation like this is that it can help include such habitats in our nationally declared contribution for carbon storage. So this is the sort of template for terrestrial environments which has been kind of pursued by our funders. And by taking this approach, we can see potentially how much those habitats might contribute to I nearly use that word, sorry, in terms of mitigating some of the carbon emissions that our human activities nationally might be producing. Not sure we actually got this far, but that was the initial intention. So, as I said, there were 4 regional reports. Here you can see these are the blue carbon regions. They don't quite correspond to CP2 regions, but effectively they split the UKCs into roughly equal chunks, except for a substantially larger chunk around Scotland, which you can see here. So those reports essentially involved reviews of the scientific information and the data available on the blue carbon habitats that occurred in each region, particularly emphasizing the macroalgae, the salt marshes, the seagrass beds, any biogenic reefs there might be in those sorts of areas, although I'll come back to that in a bit, and particularly, because it's so extensive, seabed sediments. Our aim was to kind of estimate the extent of each of those habitats from mapped data, where that mapped data was available, and in a couple of instances where we didn't have mapped data, which was pretty evident from the get-go, we had to perhaps try to use habitat suitability modeling to come up with some idea of what kind of extent those habitats might be if those habitats extended into all the environmental conditions for which the conditions might be suitable. And then from reviews of the literature and measurements of carbon in the sediments, particularly, and in these blue carbon habitats fringing the seabed sediments, establish what the carbon stocks might be in those places, and to estimate the rates at which carbon might be accumulating each one of those habitats. So, and finally, to kind of try to stitch all that information back together into some sort of ecosystem scale, or kind of at least regional scale and national scale synthesis of those carbon flows and accumulation rates. So I'll start with the summary from our work, which I'll explain in a minute. Eucalyptus teak-fall sediments contain, in the top 10 centimetres at least, about 240 million tonnes of organic carbon. The reason I'm talking about the top 10 centimetres is because those are the depths which are most well known. They've been sampled using grabs, cores, all sorts of things, other kinds of methods, well, primarily grabs and cores, which only extend to the very shallow surface. Plus, those are the depths where carbon has most recently been deposited. So it's fresh and new stuff over the last decades to hundreds of years. And finally, those depths are probably the depths where those carbon stores are most actively being remineralized, and also are mostly being impacted by physical disturbance of the seabed. which, as we all might know, primarily takes the form of bottom trawling. So the coastal vegetated habitats, which kind of the classical blue carbon habitats, those seagrass beds and salt marshes, store about 2.6 million tons in the top 10 centimeters of sediment and in the biomass of the plants themselves. And from what we can estimate, that kelp perhaps stores around about 1.4 million tons as actual biomass. We think there's a lot of kelp out there. And those habitats themselves contribute organic carbon to the system as a whole as particulates, essentially detritus, around about what we think is around about 290,000 tons of carbon per year. And they may store around about 212,000 tons of organic carbon per year in the sediments associated with them. But those estimates are all based on like a many-tiered set of assumptions and often on limited data, which has meant that we've had to model or extrapolate from a few experimental studies to a much wider area. So for some things, we have lack of data. We don't have maps for all those habitats, particularly the kelp forests, for example. We might be using values from experimental studies which might not be that applicable. And obviously, scientists can't measure accumulation rates everywhere. And we might not be incorporating really important elements in our kind of system scale understanding. But those things will emerge as we go through the next plots. So we built strongly on this map on the left-hand side here, which is an estimation of the organic carbon density in the top 10 centimeters of seafloor sediments, published 4 years ago now by Craig Smeaton and Bill Turrell and Carly Hunt and Bill Austin. And this data set was phenomenally useful based on British Geological Survey samples and a lot of statistical interpolation between the spatial locations of each of these samples. And here the colour gives you an indication of what the organic carbon density is in those places. You can see I'm drawing your attention here to areas of the west coast of Scotland where deep troughs and areas around Scottish sea lochs have got a very high proportion of sediment organic carbon, and other places like parts of the North Sea, the rocky areas around southwest Britain, and some parts of the Channel have got far less organic carbon per unit area. We used the EU CMAP dataset to essentially use experimentally derived estimates of accumulation rates of carbon to come up with area-based estimates. So knowing what I'll go into that in a second. So that's the second data set we used. We used the EU seabed habitat map to match with the organic carbon density map here, and to use habitat-specific accumulation rates. Here are those seabed sediments and the results from looking at the whole of the EU, the UK EEZ and the continental shelf bit. About 900,000 square kilometres, and those 240 million or so tons of carbon stored in the top 10 centimetres, and around about 13.5 million tons per year potentially from that literature review. So this is a bit of a detail, if you like. So each one of these UNIS habitats has estimates of carbon accumulation rates from various studies, which you might be able to read down the right-hand side. Some of those studies are for UKCs, some of them are not for UKCs, but they give values for the rates of carbon added to those particular habitats across the whole range of them. And so this was our main basis for making projections of totals amounts of carbon sequestered into, accumulated into kind of seabed habitats. You can see there are a few numbers here which are quite big. So particularly for sublittoral mud habitats, those are the ones in which which the literature suggests that there is the highest rates of carbon accumulation. And you see one of those estimates has got my name next to it, which says 155 grams carbon per square meter per year. So that's what our 13.5 million tons per year estimate was based on. You can see a lot of the other values much smaller than that. I will draw your attention to one immediately next to it by Marcus Diesing et al., which came out again relatively recently, which suggests a much lower number, of which more to come. So this is the kind of the broad approach. It's possible to turn those values into single estimates by multiplying the average rate by the total area of each one of those types of habitats, and that's how this 13.5 million ton value was brought up with. But if you use the range of values and draw numbers from basically what is a normal distribution of potential values, in which the kind of the average is the middle, and the minimums and maximums are kind of the define the outer limits of those potential numbers. You can generate this kind of probability curve here. You can see showing how likely we think that numbers might be based on our original numbers. But as I've said here, we think we might be a bit overestimating the rates of accumulation in study areas. And it might be that some of those studies of accumulation rates might have deliberately focused on places where organic carbon is thought to accumulate more rapidly than others. People don't tend to want to study places that haven't got so much accumulation. So looking again, probably this was pretty much towards the end of our review process. So it was a bit of a kind of a reflection on what we've done. And I think here's a study by Marcus Diesing's group. Marcus Diesing's now based in Bergen, I think. But he looked at some other sedimentation rate data from the North Sea. You can see this little map on the right-hand side here, looking at how fast sediments were accumulating. And he found that actually for large parts of the North Sea, for which we might have assumed there was a higher rate of accumulation, there was pretty low on the left-hand side rates of organic carbon accumulation rates. So those blue areas are essentially, there's almost no organic carbon accumulation. So using this value, these much lower values, we get something which is categorically smaller than the previous estimate. So yeah, it just illustrates how little we know, or how little confidence we can have, perhaps, in some of the data we've got already. There's still a lot to be learned here in how we apply these single point based experimental work studies across broad areas. Yeah, as you can see, the same estimate comes out at 0.4 million tons carbon per year if we take Marcus Diesing's approach. So we think beyond sea lochs, which we're pretty confident about, that these broadly muddy habitats more widely might be less accumulating than we previously thought. So where do we go with that sort of thing? So this is where we're stepping a little out. Well, we're stepping beyond the work. I'll come back to kind of the vegetated habitats in a minute. So perhaps we need to better models understanding our kind of density and accumulation rates of organic carbon. So I've been involved in a project called NPA Europe, which is a Horizons Europe project led by Mark Costello at Nord University, and includes some quite nice blue carbon elements to it, led by Dorte Kraus-Jensen from Aarhus University. So here, this map here shows organic carbon percentages in sediment samples, again across well, now across the whole of Europe. So 43,000 odd data points. And because I'm interested in wave exposure, I suggested we might look at this as a potential predictor. And it turns out it's a really great predictor of organic carbon in intertidal and shallow water sediments. It explains nearly 20% of the variation between all those data points. And it seems to be more important than almost any other variable. Essentially, what we're saying is that wave-sheltered environments tend to have a greater proportion of organic carbon than in wave-exposed environments, which pretty much stands to make sense. If anybody's been on the coast and paddled around, you only get muddy habitats in very wave-sheltered conditions, and those muddy habitats support a greater quantity of organic carbon than the kind of coarse sediment, sandy areas in more wave-exposed conditions. And indeed, in the UK, the habitats themselves spread out along the wave exposure gradient, so there's 40% of our wave-sheltered coastline is made up of mud habitats, whereas in very wave-exposed places, there's far less mud, as you might expect. Probably none at all. It's just, it's just the way it goes. And if you plot the amount of organic carbon versus wave exposure, there's a really strong relationship. So that's for the future. So maybe we can hopefully refine some of those maps. Organic carbon content. So kelp, I'm just going to go through kind of those primary blue carbon habitats, starting with the one which is probably most contentious. Kelp beds, we know little about them. We know there's a lot of them, but we haven't mapped them. They're difficult to see from the air. They're in such shallow water that boats tend not to go into those places. They're well sampled in terms of their biodiversity through the Marine Nature Conservation Review, and that data set is tremendous. Yeah, I applied for a job with those guys 30 years ago, but it was great to see the actual data sets themselves. So we don't know their true extent, so we use some models. Well, I use some models to try and predict what that might be. And if you take a kind of threshold value predicted greater than 0.5 kilograms per meter squared, we might have nearly 8,000 square kilometers of kelp beds in which there is a living biomass, which is slightly different from the one you just saw. But the important thing is that they store no carbon whatsoever long term. It's all living biomass, and all that biomass is exported. Here's a little side step into how those models were produced. Depth, types of substratum, wave fetch, temperatures, and, well, chlorophyll A, which is basically a proxy for kind of light attenuation and perhaps nutrient availability. Essentially, with some models, gives you predictive maps, and that's how we got to those numbers. We can also estimate how much carbon might be exported to the seabed from this detritus. So if you've got the area and you know what the production rate in terms of kind of loss of material from existing plants and from the death and export breakdown of those plants themselves, we can get, with some assumptions, some idea of how much carbon is exported by kelp forest as particulates. I'm not going to go into that bit. So yeah, this is the habitat people probably are most aware of. Salt marshes, they are big. The Irish Sea has got a lot of salt marshes. The ones that have been mapped for the data which I could find, we could find around 500 square kilometers, and those salt marshes may store over 2 million tons of carbon in the top 10 centimeters. And they've got a pretty decent rate of storage, which corresponds to about over 200,000 tons per year. Work from the isotopic composition of those sediments suggests that in a lot of cases, particularly near large rivers, in estuaries, for example, much of that carbon might be from terrestrial sources, and that terrestrial carbon might be lost, might be from soils that have previously been eroded into these sorts of areas. A lot of interesting work going on at the moment, aging the stored carbon in salt marshes, and showing that much of it is quite ancient despite being relatively recently deposited, which again reinforces the idea that some of it may previously been stored all in upland soils. Seagrass beds, everybody's excited about seagrass beds, and there's a lot of effort at the moment to use seagrass beds as a focus for habitat restoration efforts. Obviously, they're subtidal, they're in shallow sandy areas, sometimes estuarine. The known extent is just over 100 square kilometres, but recent studies have suggested that that's a massive contraction from the amounts that used to be around in the 19th century, for example, largely because of declining water quality and the seagrass dieback disease. And again, a substantial amount of carbon stored in those seagrass associated soils. And so there's a lot of research going on at the moment, and a lot of financial input to attempting to restore such habitats. It feels there's quite a lot more research to be done in terms of how to do that successfully, but certainly the efforts are going in from community-based restoration schemes and more nationally. So here's not to kind of round this off too much with too many figures, but all that effort has allowed us to go with all those caveats and assumptions written into the reports to come up with some numbers which show how large an extent each of those habitats are regionally. Here's our estimates for Scotland in 2023. I know it's 2 years ago now, but it's the end of 23 anyway. So how much carbon there might be stored within each one of these habitats, how much is exported, how much is accumulated, and all the information you might want to know. Graphically, you can summarize that kind of information. So if you're excluding seabed habitats and just talking about organic carbon flowing from those true blue carbon habitats and vegetated coastal ones, kelp beds, for example, might produce 250,000 tons of particulates. Those particulates just get added to a coastal pool, if you like. And from that coastal pool, for example, we know that salt marshes might be storing around 200,000 tons. We don't know whether that kelp carbon is directly contributing to the salt marsh pool, but it just gives you a visual picture of the relative importance of each one of those. The height of each bar is proportional to the amount of carbon being transferred from one to the other. Salt marshes are again much more widespread than salts and seagrass beds, but again we have numbers there that you can refer to the report for. If you look at more broadly and include all elements of the ecosystem and look at all sources of particulate organic carbon, both from the attached vegetation, but most importantly from phytoplankton. Phytoplankton is everywhere. It's it's producing carbon all the time, and that's sinking to the seabed. And simple estimates based on a few broad assumptions suggest maybe 7 million tons of carbon is fixed by phytoplankton. Well, so is fixed and added to the seabed every year, and that dwarfs the coastal amounts. Here's that sublittoral mud storage estimate, which again we might think too much in relation. So you can see that phytoplankton and mud are the dominant elements of this carbon picture, and that the coastal bits are less important numerically, but probably as important or more important in terms of being able to manage those systems. And that's the IPCC definition of blue carbon, is that the manageable carbon storage and sequestration capacity. If we revise down our estimates for accumulation of particulates in sublittoral mud, as we were talking about before, we come across quite a different picture, and we actually reveal some of the things that we don't yet know. You can see the inputs so far exceed the outputs by quite a magnitude, and I think that's either we're getting something wrong here. There are missing stores. There is overestimation of some inputs relative to the storage rates. Probably the real sublittoral mud storage rate is somewhere between my very low and very high values. Finally, one of the aims of this was to see how well, I'll rephrase that, how much of our organic carbon stocks and accumulation capacity, sequestration capacity, lies within the UK's marine network of marine protected areas. So here's those regional maps showing on the left-hand side where those marine protected areas are. We considered all those types you can see on the right-hand side: marine conservation zones in England and Wales, nature conservation marine protected areas in Scotland, SACs, SPAs, SSI, SSIs, marine nature reserves, and SSIs in Northern Ireland. So this is without any regard to what protection measures there might be for looking after these carbon stores. It just tells you how much of those carbon stores lie within those areas. And so, again, you can drill into the report but the headline numbers are, it's variable. There's more protection in the North Sea than there is in the English Channel, and across the whole of the UK. It's 46% of that carbon is stored within some sort of designation or other. But how much is actually protected, we're not making any statements about. Getting to the end of this now. So just a little comment about, here's regionally what the relative extents of some of those habitats might be, how much gets stored in each of those habitats, and how much essentially habitats are exporting and importing relative to each other. So not asking you to look at these plots in detail, but for Scotland, the big picture is dominated by export of carbon from kelp beds, kelp habitats. For the Irish Sea, it seems to be those extensive salt marshes are most important, and their storage rates in the Irish Sea dominate that particular picture. And if you look at the balance of exports from kelp, for example, and imports to things like salt marshes, you can see how those different regions vary slightly. The English Channel, there's more storage in salt marshes than there is exported from kelps. But in Scotland, that's dominated by the kelp exports, and less so the storage of carbon in salt marshes. And I see the converse is true. Okay, I've spoken probably for long enough now, but this is where we're going next. It just so happened that towards the end of this process, there was an advert on one of the European tender portals for what essentially seemed to be the same kind of activity or review for Europe as a whole. And so perhaps rather foolishly at that point, but mostly because we were already doing this at a European scale, as I've suggested earlier, to extend this to a kind of Europe scale exercise to kind of report on what the carbon storage capacity is across Europe and what threats particularly, I've not mentioned those much in this talk, might be important for that storage capacity. And yeah, this is where we're at in the middle. We're just about to start this process. So we're going to extend our UK review. We're going to do some not back of the envelope, but broad calculations on how much carbon might be sequestered by each of those habitats. And then we'll try to make some recommendations as to how those stores and sequestration capacities might be managed and protected from those potential damaging activities. So thank you for everybody for listening, and I'm happy to take as many questions as you'll like at this point. I'm going to stop sharing.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mike, for that insightful breakdown of the carbon report. I'm just going to start running through some questions, if that's okay. We've got quite a few which are coming on Slido, and if anyone else has some, please, the link is in the chat, so do pop them in. We've got quite a bit of time, so we should be able to get through them all. So first off, just to mention, Helen Lillis has just popped in the Slido, just to say JNCC is also a minor partner in MPA Europe. So if anyone has any questions about the project following the webinar, herself and Ellie Stewart are happy to discuss it from a JNCC point of view.
Yes, sorry, I should have mentioned that too.
No, it's fine. So yeah, moving on to questions posed to Mike. So first off, someone's asked, what policy measures would you recommend to protect the carbon sequestration potential of UK seabed habitats, particularly with respect to mud?
Yeah, so I mean, it's pretty clear that it's physical disturbance which is the primary cause of resuspension of sediments. Yeah, so trawling essentially is going to resuspend some of that sediment material. There is a divergence of opinion as to how important that is. It will create some remineralization of that suspended material, but how much is controversial. There was a paper by Sala about 4 years in 2021, which suggested there would be a huge amount of remineralization, and that trawling might result in as much carbon released into the atmosphere as the UK aviation industry. I remember that headline from The Guardian, versus people who've looked at trawling in more detail and found that perhaps some of the more recalcitrant, the less easily broken down material is actually re-sedimented. So I guess in broadest terms, you would want to make sure that there was least sediment disturbance in those areas where there's most storage and most capacity for future storage. So if trawlers can avoid areas of high sediment, then that would be an easy first step. I think other policy considerations must take account of kind of potential physical disturbance of the sediment, but sometimes obviously perhaps other things might be more important.
Thank you. We've got another question which is quite similar, so you might not have anything else you want to add to it, but someone's asked, what policy changes would have the biggest impact on protecting blue carbon?
Right, okay, well, I suppose I feel, it feels like, but as somebody who's quite distant from this, that it'd be nice to see a greater visibility of the management plans of each one of those MPAs, and to see how those management plans were accounting for whichever carbon accumulating or storing habitats they had within them. Yeah, I mean, it's not a transparent. I mean, the information might be available, but it's not readily available. So, as a first step, I would think just make your MPA management plans more visible and make sure they account for, in some way, for the blue carbon habitats that lie within them and the carbon.
Makes a lot of sense. So another question, what are the major research gaps in our understanding of the UK's blue carbon?
Right, okay, so I think that some of them have been addressed already, and I think I've touched on them throughout here. Our understanding of the accumulation of carbon in sediments is patchy. And as I think I've revealed, I started out with a big number, and I actually think I came towards a small number. The reality is somewhere in between. There's very few studies of actual accumulation rates in the UK sediments. You can do this by aging the sediments as well. So you can look at the carbon, see how old it is, and see how deep it might be, and that gives you at least a ballpark of how fast it might be accumulating. I think there needs to be a lot more of that if we're going to have confidence in these kinds of numbers. The other things we don't know about, some of those coastal habitats are not, especially subtidally, they're not well mapped. And probably I'm coming back to the kelp forests. Broadly we know where they are, but we don't know how much there is. It's amazingly difficult to find data layers which include substratum type at the sort of levels of information you need to manage MPAs, and B, need to be able to estimate properly how much carbon might be in those MPAs, particularly things like SSSIs.
Next question, do you have any idea how climate change might impact sequestration rates?
Yes. I mean, one of the nice things I didn't talk about was from the MPA Europe project was there's a really strong temperature gradient across Europe from the north to the south, which seems to be consistent with the idea that warmer temperatures means a greater remineralization of carbon. So less carbon stored further south than near the Arctic. So a whole load up around Svalbard and northern Norway, and progressively less as you get towards the Mediterranean. So climate change will speed up the breakdown and reduce the storage of carbon in seabed sediments. Also, some of the habitat-forming species, particularly the kelps, are temperature sensitive. They're basically cold water organisms. So, in the next 50 to 100 years, there may well be a decline in those kelps, but they may be replaced by other things.
Brilliant, thank you. Next question, do shellfish beds have significant carbon sequestration potential? Okay,
that one is one which we have wrestled with, and there is, again, a divergence of opinion, in as much as, so the complex three-dimensional structure that shellfish beds creates accumulates particulates. So there's kind of a collecting, those horse mussel beds, for example, has got a rich kind of environment in which those particulates accumulated, but these horse mussels and other suspension feeding invertebrates, their job is to turn organic carbon particulates back into carbon dioxide. So they are processing some of that material that might otherwise be stored. So in carbon terms, they're also respiring, and the production of calcified shells also releases CO2. So that they're net exporters of CO2 rather than importers. But they're incredibly important for ecosystem services, biodiversity, all that other things. And my kind of, if there was a final message to take away from this, is that blue carbon's one thing, but biodiversity is super important. We can, a dead world can store a lot of carbon, but life as we know it needs to continue, and that that is not necessarily compatible with massive carbon stores.
That's really interesting. Thank you. So next question, when was this review completed? More up-to-date seabed habitat maps are available.
Thank you. September 24 was when it was released, although we are aware that new information was arriving all the time. So it's a snapshot. So by the way, so if you contact the wildlife trusts, so Bex Lynham at the wildlife trusts will be able to point you to a place where we've stored all that digital data for anybody to kind of interrogate.
Yeah, I think the example they gave was the EU CMAP 2023.
Yeah, too late for this review, I'm afraid, but yeah.
Well, then we've just got a couple more notes from Helen Lillis. So I think she's asked, are there any stats on how to define mud for quantifying blue carbon? She said, I often see references to UNIS mud, but that def is based on suitability for mud-loving in fauna.
All right. Okay.
Can I explain my question? Because I was very limited on how many characters I could put in that. So, in UNIS habitat maps, in the UNIS classification, we have to decide what is mud in terms of what is a muddy habitat. So we have to, when we've just got sediment information and not information about the communities, we've decided in the UK that we're going to say 80% mud sand, 80% of the sediment is muddy, to be called a muddy habitat. But when you want to work out the extent of mud, i.e. sediment that holds the most amount of carbon, which is at the finer end of the grain size distribution, is it right to just use that same definition that we use for habitat classification? Or is there a different grain size distribution that actually captures that, I guess, niche for storing carbon? And has that analysis been done?
I think this is where you need to be talking to my geology colleagues, because they're all over fault classifications and the relationships between percentage organic carbon and sediment particle size analyses. Yeah, I mean, it was beyond the scope of what we could do to get too detailed into that. But I do agree with you that kind of, I think one of the drawbacks and criticisms of the work I level at our report is, you can't treat all those UNIS habitats as if they were all the same. I mean, there's quite a lot of variation within each kind of habitat. Yeah, so yeah, it's a technical question I can't answer, but I would refer you to Craig Smeaton or Bill Austin, who might be able to give you a better answer.
That's us at the end of our questions. So I'll just round off by saying a big thank you, Mike. That was really, really great. So yeah.
Well, like I say, it's happy to take anybody wants to email me. I can do my best to answer any other questions you've got. So yeah, thank you. Thanks for listening.
Awesome. Thank you.